Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia,
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code.
a podcast series focused on debunking the myths about the discipline of behavioral science and arming our listeners with the information they need to make sense of behavioral science and to help them apply it to their work as marketers. So today's topic is the real consequences of bad social science. And this is sort of part two, was inspired from the topic that we discussed last time on nudges and
Yep.
is it a nudge or a nag? And really, what happens when we create these interventions that don't go the way that we want them to go or really have these unintended consequences. So, Brad, I'm going to kick it over to you. What are all the things that could go wrong when interventions are not, framed up, researched, executed the right way?
Right. Great question. Thank you. So, as we've been saying, there's really three ways that social science experiments, I guess, as we call them, or behavior change attempts, whether it's, this is a different discussion, but you and I talk sometimes, like even if it's just public policy that changes, in some ways it's a social science experiment. Like, let's see if by lowering the drinking age, we can reduce drunk driving accidents among teenagers. That was the idea behind it, right? So that was policy, but that was sort of an experiment. It worked. But there are always experiments that don't. And then there are always initiatives that really not only don't work, but do the opposite, right? So there's three ways you can look at things. One is you try something, it doesn't do anything, right? That's just a waste of money and time. That's fine. The other is you try something and it does what you wanted it to do, but it turns out that that's not exactly what you wanted to happen because there's some secondary effect somewhere else that's catastrophic or just not what you wanted, right? So, but the worst, maybe from a design standpoint or social science standpoint, is what's called a backfire, which is you try and change a behavior, you design a program that's supposed to modify a behavior in one direction, and you literally have the opposite effect. It goes in the opposite direction of what you intended. And
Yikes.
believe it or not, there's a lot of very large public health initiatives that have done that. So
Wow.
there are consequences to bad social science. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's obviously not great. When you don't see an effect at all, it's, to your point, it's a waste of money, but, significant. Who wants to waste money? But I think when you see an effect that's literally like the opposite of what you want it to happen, that's problematic. So what's an example of that?
So anyone my age, and you said you too, right? Like will remember D.A.R.E, Drug
Oh,
Awareness and Resistance Education.
yep. Yep.
Yeah, that didn't work. In fact, not only did it not work, it seems to have encouraged people to take more drugs. Now, I don't want to overstate that. The
Oh,
data
wow.
on that one are loose, right? But so here's the story. The D.A.R.E came out. It was Nancy Reagan's brainchild with a couple other people. Give you a sense of time frame, right? Late 80s and mid-late 80s. And they wanted people to be aware of drugs so that they would then not take drugs. The awareness leading to resistance was the sort of logical fallacy here, because the way that they presented the data, people were fairly certain. There's 20 years of data on this. The way they presented the data was so absolute and so everything will kill you, touch a joint and you'll die kind of stuff. Well, all you have to do is go to the average high school party and you're going to see somebody smoking a joint who's not dead the next day. So they kind of overstated their claims, and the belief is by doing so, they destroyed their own credibility. In most scenarios, they had no impact whatsoever, no measurable impact on drug taking behavior among teens. But in the suburbs, they seem to have increased drug experimentation. So the data are pretty solid there that in at least one cohort, you've got kids going through a public funded, very large program that went on for 2 decades and more. And not only didn't it work, but your kids' exposure to it might have increased the chances that they'd puff on a joint. That is a classic backfire. And there's another part to that story, which I think is more in your world, which is the sort of cognitive bias of just, I don't know, sunk costs or fallacy or something, but like they just refused to believe that the data, that it didn't work. And so they just kept going.
Right. They refused to believe the data because they were observing a different reality, right? So I think that goes back to what you were saying. The way that we present information, it
Oh,
has
sorry.
to
I
be.
mean, the people who ran the program
Oh,
refused
okay.
to
Yeah.
believe the information. No, the
Right.
kids,
Okay.
I don't, there's theories. Nobody's ever done a
Right.
study as to why. All you can do is look at survey data. It's not perfect, but of course, as this very large public initiative, there was a lot of money spent as well studying it. And what's interesting, and it's probably more from a cognitive bias standpoint, is they just didn't want to believe that it didn't work
Got it.
until
Got it.
they finally did.
Okay, all right, got it. So, but then back to what I was saying around like, so what went wrong? It was the information that was provided. I mean, it wasn't that, I mean, yes, it was inaccurate. You know, not everything, like the whole, like, if you do any drugs, you'll die 100%. Like, that's what's going to happen to you. Obviously, there was a trust issue there, right? Like, I'm sure
Yeah.
kids, when they were first exposed to that message, they probably believed it to be true. And then they saw a different reality as they were maybe getting older and going to parties and whatnot. And then they just didn't believe it anymore. So
I think that's
what
fair. And I also think, we're getting into education. It seems that effective drug resistance education comes down to teaching people to make good choices in general,
mm,
giving them the wherewithal to have the ability to say no, as opposed to just telling them say no, but not telling them how to do it. Peer pressure is a big thing. So, I mean, there's a lot that goes into
yeah,
this, right? I'm not saying that D.A.R.E was an ill-intentioned program. It was just a very poorly executed program. What was interesting is you would hope that your drug education and resistance program would not encourage or
right.
result in more children taking drugs. During the pandemic, there was a lot of attempts to get people vaccinated, if you remember. And it wasn't that long ago. And there was one of them that when it started, I thought to myself, this is a terrible idea. Now, I'm calling out one of my good predictions. I will be honest, like everyone, I conveniently forget all of my bad predictions. I had loads of bad predictions during COVID. But this one I remember distinctly talking to people about,
Mhm.
going like, I think it's a very poor idea to pay people to get vaccinated. And here's why I thought so. And it turns out that this is maybe totally correct, right? Which was, you might not get that many extra people to get vaccinated. If it's a couple $100, you'll probably accelerate the process, but not by that much, and it was never a couple $100. It was things like scratch offs and stuff. There were a couple of reports of very large payments, but I don't think people actually got paid all that much. It was things like lottery tickets and, something beneficial if you go and get your vaccination. Fine. I didn't think that was going to work. It turns out financial incentives, we've now studied it in retrospect, they didn't work among the hesitant. They didn't really accelerate anything. However, what they did do was turn off a lot of people. So if you were hesitant and believed because of trust issues with the government, or you thought Bill Gates was involved or something, and then all of a sudden they're starting to pay you, then there was a lot of people who looked at that and said, now I know there's something wrong with this, because why else would they pay me for this?
Mhm.
Now, look, you could say that those people were never going to get vaccinated anyway. And by those people, I mean people who believe that there was a microchip in it may not have been on the fence. They may have been absolutely resistant, right? But certainly the nature of hesitancy was increased in certain communities by the offer to pay people to get the vaccine. It was seen as proof that there was something nefarious afoot. No one has ever paid me to take a drug before. And
Right.
frankly, that was a predictable consequence, right? If all you had to do was read what people were concerned about, and you would think, well, maybe we should put ourselves in their shoes and go, trust is kind of lacking here. What would make them trust me more? Offering to pay them to take this thing would not make me
Right.
trust them more, right? So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I just think it was lazy. It was a desperation move. I totally get it. We didn't have the luxury of time. On the other hand, and I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but you could have seen this one coming, right? I think, anyway.
Yeah, I don't think that we needed the luxury of time to know that could have had bad effects. I think you brought up a really good point, and I want to reiterate it. When we look to design interventions, it's really important to understand the emotional state of the consumer audience as to like why they maybe are not engaging in a behavior, because to your
Right.
point, trust was a huge barrier. And in designing an intervention, if you're trying to build trust, that's really not the way to do it, by like quote unquote bribing people. We talk about emotion a lot. Intention, belief, all of that stuff is important when it comes to changing behavior, but I would say emotion drives so much of what we do. And if we could understand that a little bit better, we'd probably have more successful interventions, honestly.
Yeah, I'm just
Okay.
wondering why you put air quotes around bribing on that
Well,
one.
yeah,
Like,
I
to me,
mean, I guess it was
it's actually just bribing, right?
right, right,
So,
right,
sort
right.
of like telling your kid you'll buy them a book if they brush their teeth or something. It's not, I mean, it's really no different than just paying someone to do something they don't want to do.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so those are like honestly really great examples of when it has like the opposite effect.
Sometimes those get called backfire, but you had a couple good examples in mind that you wanted to talk about of
Well, yeah.
the adjacent behaviors, right? Like, yes, you succeed in doing A, but you also succeed in doing B, and B was terrible or something.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to, again, when we think about interventions, it's important to look at the whole person and the behavior, not in a silos, but in an ecosystem of behavior. So if we think about unintended consequences and like an adjacent behavior, there are so many examples. One that I like is the example of a study or a program that was run to decrease water wastage in households. And this was run all across the country through various interventions, whether it be providing information, there was like rewards, like, discounts and that sort of a thing. But what ended up happening is, I mean, it worked in the sense of people did consume less water and there was less wastage. But what ended up happening was people were then consuming more electricity, which was really odd. Like, how did that happen? That wasn't an issue before, but when people decreased usage of one thing, it increased the usage of
Right.
another. And if you think about it, it totally makes sense because I feel like the way that our brains are wired, I mean, in that case specifically, it's like, okay, well, I'm making this one effort for this one behavior to really change and to minimize and whatever it may be. So you kind of like give yourself a pass for other behaviors because I feel like the way that the human brain works, it's kind of like, okay,
Right.
well, I'm doing this one thing and now I think it's like called like moral licensing or something where you kind of give yourself the license to do a behavior that you weren't doing before because from a moral standpoint you're kind of making up for it in another behavior. So
Oh,
I don't
right,
know.
right, 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 right.
There's a
Like,
lot to unpack there, but I think that that's pretty
well,
interesting.
I think
And
I kind of invoke that when somebody calls up and says, "Do you want to give to the Policeman's Sergeant Benevolent Association?" I go, "No, I give in other ways," which I do,
right.
right? But I'm like,
Yep.
I'm not just saying no, but I'm actually covering myself. That makes sense.
Yeah, or
I
like when you work out, like I mean, I know this kind of goes both ways, but if you're exercising and you're whatever, being active, taking walks, prioritizing physical health, a lot of times you'll then maybe like let that suffer in other areas, whether that be like the food that you're consuming or
right.
maybe you take up another unhealthy habit that you really didn't have before because you're like, well, at least I got the working out down and now I can, so I don't know. I think
Yeah,
human
look,
beings
well,
are interesting.
yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of unintended consequences, right? I think dieting, for example,
Right, exactly.
tons of unintended consequences there, and even just which diet, right? So I don't think maybe if you lose weight on Atkins, that's great, but if you do it the way a friend of mine did it, which is by eating like or keto, I think it was, but he was eating like a pound of bacon every other day.
Oh,
That's not
geez.
good for you either, right?
Right.
But to your point, like let's think about these interventions and let's put in a medical framework, right? What does this
Hmm.
mean to to the people around us? If you have a behavior change intervention, there are bound to be behaviors associated with it. And
Yeah.
the example that they often use when they start talking about unintended consequences is something like exercise. If we increase children's time on bicycles, that's a good thing. They're outdoors, they're biking, they're getting fit. We will increase the number of bicycle accidents that children have. And you just have to make a decision, is that worth it or not?
Hmm.
If you don't ever factor in that right hand side of the equation, you just start doing things and they end up having a lot of unintended consequences. And I think that for us in the medical space, we're very used to dealing with off target effects. They're called adverse events, right? We
Hmm.
don't really think of the interventions that we create for our clients or clients, whomever, right, to change behaviors that they might actually have a secondary effect. The reason that it's problematic is A, you're not fully designing what you're doing. You're just sort of shooting from the hip, like the vaccines thing. Like sometimes we do have time. But I think B is when you have the adverse events, the off-target effects in view, you can do something about it. So you can do things to minimize the harm of those bicycle accidents. You can make them wear helmets and put in bike lanes. You know what I mean? Like there are
Yeah,
things you can
absolutely.
do provided you've thought it through. If you just go like, well, let's pay people to get them vaccinated and then you walk away, you can end up doing a lot of damage. And the one example that you and I talked about in a corporate setting is the kind of thing where people show up and say, we're here with you on your journey and we're going to support you till the end of time. and sign up for this copay card for this drug. This used to happen in multicultural marketing where they would go to a city or a place they'd set up in a traditional, air quotes, African American location, like a church, right? And they would use that church as a screening event or something like that. And then they would brand it and they would sort of pat themselves on the back that they had done something tremendous. And then they wouldn't continue it as soon as the drug went off patent or as soon as the new marketing manager came in. And you might have achieved your primary goal of getting some phone numbers, getting some people screened, but your overall goal of like, what is the corporate reputation in the neighborhood has been shot. Because, right, like how many times do people show up and go like, we're here for you as long as there's money in it, and then they disappear? How stupid are people, right? So I think you have to be very careful about what you think of as the consequences of your actions when you design these things. What's an acceptable off-target effect? How can we prepare for those effects? How can we mitigate them? That's exactly what oncologists do when they give you platinum-based chemotherapy and go, you might vomit, I'll give you this. You might lose your hair, here's the number for a wig maker, right? Like we do anticipate problems in healthcare and do something about them. Every single one of the cases that we've talked about, nobody had anticipated the problems, not an institutional way, certainly not in a way that made them able to address it in a timely fashion. Basically, D.A.R.E remained unchanged for 2 decades. Then they kind of changed it and then they killed it. But I think the part that they changed essentially so transformed that it's not even D.A.R.E anymore. But for the longest time, they just wouldn't change it. And so, eventually it dies, but not before it does some harm. So again, I think D.A.R.E more than anything made us all think that the government has no idea what it's doing when it comes to drug education, right? I think that was the meta message. It was laughable, some of that stuff, especially as you got older. So
everyone made fun of D.A.R.E.
Yeah, and you remember this is your brain on drugs, and it's like the scrambled egg thing. Who hasn't seen the T-shirt? And this is your brain with a side of hash browns, right? Like, I mean, they ask themselves to be made fun of, but that's what teenagers do. I think we could have seen that it wasn't working earlier and done something. We probably don't need to go down this road, actually.
Yeah. No, yes, I completely agree. And I think you really summarized it nicely, like what it means to have a successful intervention. And honestly, like we always say, like just doing a little bit of that background and that an upfront legwork into understanding the whole person, all of the behaviors, like really taking a step back and digging deep. It'll really help ensure the long-term success of interventions as well as in the short term, is it even working at all? So, thanks, Brad. That was awesome.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's an important question.
I feel like there's still probably more examples and more to talk about on kind of born out of nudging, but talking about behavior change interventions as a whole. So
having a podcast about bad social science is job security.
Right. So. There's so much to talk about.
All
right. Well, until next time. Yeah. Bye, everyone. Bye. I'm Sonika Garcia.
I'm Brad Davidson.
Yeah.
Breaking the Code is a podcast by Havas Health and U's Medical Anthropology Department. Created and produced by Brad Davidson and Sonika Garcia. Content editing done by Catherine Rossi. Post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration by all of you. Thanks for listening and your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating and subscribe. Until next time.